Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the ZapSec Modernization Series. My name is James Camerata, Vice President at ZapSec, and I'm joined by Hitesh Kumar, Senior Security Architect. Today, we'll discuss essential security guardrails for healthcare. In January 2025, families in 4 U.S. states woke up to find their child support payments had stopped and food assistance hotlines went dark. And the reason was a ransomware group had been sitting inside a government contractor's network for 84 days and nobody noticed. Hitesh, could you take us through the timeline? When did this start and how long did it take to surface?
Yeah, sure. Here's what we know about the breach so far. A ransomware group called SafePay gained unauthorized access to Conduent's environment on October 21st, 2024. However, they were not discovered until January 13th of 2025. That is 84 days later. And during that window, they exfiltrated an estimated 8.5 terabytes of data. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the equivalent of 850,000 filing cabinets filled with paper documents, which is a lot of data.
That is remarkable. Didn't they also exceed the breach notification timeline required for HIPAA compliance?
That is where it gets worse. Conduent confirmed the breach publicly on January 22nd of 2025, but they did not begin sending notification letters to the affected individuals until October 2025, a 9-month gap. But HIPAA requires notifications to be sent within 16 days, 60 days. And we also noticed the affected user count also escalated dramatically after the initial filing, which cited 10.5 million affected. But by March 2026, the numbers exceeded 25 million, with Texas alone reporting over 15 million impacted individuals.
How did they get in? Was this some kind of advanced, sophisticated attack?
Well, Conduent has been remarkably opaque about the specific attack vector. Its SEC filing and public statements disclose only that a threat actor gained unauthorized access. However, they probably use the same playbook that has worked against dozens of organizations. In another SafePay breach, we know they exploited a misconfigured VPN gateway where local accounts could authenticate without going through multi-factor authentication at all. So once they were in, they used tools that ship with Windows like PSExec, RDP, or SMB file shares to move across the network. Then they would escalate the privileges to domain admin using weak or compromised credentials. They gathered up all the data, compressed it, and exfiltrated it out using some tools like rclone. And there's nothing special in that playbook, right? And every one of these is a known documented MITRE TTP.
So let's get prescriptive about what failed, because for many CISOs watching, the uncomfortable question is, could this happen to us?
Right. And the honest answer for many organizations is yes. Let me walk you through four key security failures we identified because each one maps to a gap we see in healthcare environments all the time. First, the prolonged dwell time. 84 days without detection means there was no behavioral analytics, no anomaly detection, and no functional alerts on this suspicious activity. Second, there was no meaningful network segmentation. The attackers traversed the environment freely using standard lateral movement tools, and the PHI data was not in a separate security zone. Third, a complete exfiltration blind spot existed. 8.5 terabytes left the network over 84 days. That's almost 100 gig a day without triggering any DLP or egress monitoring or network anomaly detection. That's unacceptable. And lastly, weak vendor governance. Conduent security posture was not validated through continuous monitoring and or independent assessments.
And here's what's really egregious. Conduent was already breached in 2020 by the Maze ransomware group through an unpatched Citrix vulnerability. And yet, 4 years later, the same class of exploit worked again.
That is the critical point. That tells you the remediation after the first breach was either not sustained or effective. And it raises a hard question for every organization that relied on Conduent. What did your vendor security assessment actually validate? If you're relying on annual questionnaires and SOC 2 reports to manage third party risk for vendors that touch PHI, you're essentially hoping for the best.
So let's flip this around. For CISOs watching this who are thinking about their own environment and their own vendor relationships, what should they be doing? What are the guardrails that would have actually stopped this?
Right. I want to frame this practically because the temptation is always to list technologies, but the question is really which controls directly break the specific kill chain. So let me map the guardrails to the failures we just discussed. First, identity and zero trust. This is where you can stop adversaries like SafePay at the front door. One should start with phishing resistant MFA, meaning FIDO2 hardware keys or WebAuthn on every remote access point instead of just SMS codes or app based push notification that can be fatigue attacked. If an attacker cannot authenticate, the kill chain breaks at step 1. And critically, you also need to audit your VPN configurations for local accounts or service accounts that can bypass multi-factor authentication entirely. And on the privileged access side, you should be vaulting and rotating every administrator credential and use just in time access so those credentials are not sitting there waiting to be harvested. So that if an attacker gets a VPN session but cannot escalate to domain administrator, the attack potentially stalls. So the access should follow just in time and least privilege access principles.
What about once someone is already inside? Because the reality is no perimeter is perfect.
Right. And that's pillar two, network data and architecture. Zero trust calls to assume breach. That means PHI needs to live in segmented enclaves with restricted access. So we should microsegment instead of just using VLANs. And we should be enforcing context based policies with segmentation where tools like PSExec and RDP cannot cross these boundaries. We should also encrypt data both at rest and while in transit. And we should classify and tokenize PHI and implement DLP with egress monitoring. Because you need to know when someone is compressing gigabytes of files and transferring them outbound. That's not a subtle signal, it's a loud one if you're listening for it.
And I'd like to hear about visibility, because it sounds like a lot of this comes down to whether anyone is actually watching.
Exactly. And that's pillar three, detection, response, and governance. On the detection side, we need to use an EDR, NDR, or XDR with AI driven behavioral analytics that can spot credential abuse, unusual lateral movement, and mass file access patterns. And your SOC needs to be running 24/7 and it needs to have actually rehearsed a ransomware scenario not once a year as a tabletop exercise, but at least quarterly with an incident response plan and real decision making under pressure.
My takeaway is on the vendor governance side, healthcare organizations need to take specific actions. For example, they need continuous monitoring of vendor security posture and independent assessments. Contractual breach notification SLAs should be tighter than HIPAA's 60-day window. Data minimization requirements should be tight. For example, if your vendor doesn't need to hold 5 years of claims history, they shouldn't have it.
Correct.
So I think from here, it'd be good to know how ZapSec helps organizations actually get these guardrails into production. Because the gap between knowing what to do and doing it is where a lot of organizations get stuck.
Yes, absolutely. And at ZapSec, we help organizations operationalize these guardrails. Our frameworks define the architectural patterns and governance structures for zero trust, identity modernization, and network segmentation purpose built for healthcare environments. Our blueprints convert those patterns into implementation ready architectures drawn from real engagements. So organizations are not starting from a blank page. And most importantly, our policy as code layer delivers consistent and intent based policy enforcement because security controls that are not continuously validated become shelfware. The Conduent breach proves that point, right? They were breached in 2020, remediated, and were breached again in 2024 using the same class of attack. This shows that consistent and intent based enforcement would have been the difference.
Well, thanks very much, Hitesh. That was very practical and insightful. And so, to summarize here, if your organization relies on third-party vendors that process protected health information, if your security posture has not been independently validated in the last 12 months, or if your team has not rehearsed a ransomware scenario this quarter, the Conduent breach is your warning shot. You can reach me or Hitesh or email us at zapsec.com to discuss the essential guardrails for healthcare. Thank you for watching this edition of the ZapSec Modernization Series.